In the heart of ancient Jerusalem, where dust and divinity collided, there stood a structure so magnificent that even the sun seemed to bow before it. This was not merely a building of stone and gold. This was the axis upon which the world turned, the place where heaven touched earth, where blood flowed to silence the cries of sin. For nearly a millennium, pilgrims journeyed across deserts and mountains, their eyes fixed on one destination, the temple. But what they found there was more than architecture. It was a system, a machine of purification, a bridge between the mortal and the eternal. The Temple Mount rose from the Judean hills like a crown of white limestone, visible for miles in every direction. By day, its walls reflected the merciless Middle Eastern sun, creating a beacon that burned in the consciousness of every believer. By night, the glow of perpetual fire danced across its courtyards, a reminder that the divine presence never slept, never rested, never ceased its demands. This was the Second Temple, reconstructed by a tyrant named Herod, a man who built monuments to compensate for the emptiness in his soul. Yet in his madness, he created something that transcended his intentions. But temples do not last forever. Empires crumble, fires consume. And on a spring afternoon in the year 70 AD, Roman soldiers would set this sacred ground ablaze, reducing centuries of devotion to ash and memory. The question that haunts us across 2 millennia is not how it was destroyed, but what it meant while it stood. What happened within those walls? What rituals were performed in the darkness? What blood was spilled on that ancient altar? And why, after all this time, do some still believe another temple must rise? This is not a story about religion. This is a story about power, about systems of control disguised as divine mandate, about the human obsession with accessing the unreachable. We will walk through courtyards where thousands once gathered, ascend steps that led toward increasingly restricted zones, and finally stand before the veil that separated humanity from whatever lay beyond. We will witness the machinery of atonement, the architecture of separation, the engineering of the sacred, and we will ask the question that no one wanted to answer. What if the temple was never meant to stand forever? What if its destruction was not a tragedy but a fulfillment? What if the tearing of that veil was not an accident but a declaration? Come, the shadows are waiting. The stones remember everything.
Before we start, I need your help. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing these hidden truths to light.
Before there was a temple, there was only a mountain. Mount Moriah rose from the earth like a broken tooth, its slopes irregular and unforgiving, its summit too small for the vision that haunted King Herod's dreams. He stood there one morning, his purple robe snapping in the wind, and declared that nature itself would bend to his will. What God had made insufficient, man would remake grand. This was not merely construction. This was war against geography, against limitation, against the very shape of creation. The engineers arrived first, men who understood mathematics and stone, who could calculate weight and stress and the 1,000 ways that ambition could collapse into rubble. They surveyed the mountain, measured its contours, and delivered their verdict. Impossible. The platform Herod demanded would require moving mountains, literally. It would need to span 480 meters in length and 300 meters in width, creating 140,000 square meters of level ground where none existed. 12 football stadiums could fit side by side in that space. The engineering required was beyond anything attempted in the ancient world. But Herod was not a man who accepted limitations. He had murdered his own sons, drowned his favorite wife, and rebuilt entire cities to match his paranoia. A mountain was nothing compared to the demons in his mind. He ordered the quarries opened, the workforce assembled, the impossible made mandatory, and so began a construction project that would consume decades, exhaust generations, and create a platform so precise that modern engineers still struggle to explain how it was achieved without machinery, without computers, without any of the tools we consider essential. The workers came in waves, thousands of them, their backs bent under the weight of history. They cut into the living rock with bronze tools and determination, extracting blocks of limestone that weighed as much as houses. Some stones measured 12 meters in length, 80 to 150 tons of compressed calcium and ancient sea life. But even these giants were not enough for Herod's vision. Deep in the western wall, they placed what would later be called the Western Stone, 13.6 meters long, 570 tons of defiance against gravity and common sense. It remains one of the largest monoliths ever moved by human hands in the ancient world. Each stone received technical markings, was adjusted to exact angles, and then transported to fit into the wall with millimetric precision. This was not crude stacking. This was surgical assembly on a massive scale. When the outer wall stood complete, the real work began. Filling the interior, workers hauled endless loads of compacted earth, gravel, and smaller stones, creating layers upon layers, transforming the irregular mountainside into a perfectly level platform. The mountain disappeared beneath human will, and upon this artificial ground, the temple would rise, a monument to man's eternal desire to build a stairway to heaven, even if heaven had never asked for one. When the platform was complete, construction began on the temple itself, and those who saw it being built described it in terms usually reserved for apocalyptic visions. It rose approximately 45 meters into the sky, taller than most modern buildings, its surface covered in gold that caught the sun and threw it back with such intensity that looking directly at it could damage your eyes. This was intentional. The temple was designed to be overwhelming, to assault the senses, to remind every observer of their smallness before the divine. Beauty was weaponized here, transformed into an instrument of awe and submission. The columns that supported the structure were not merely functional, they were statements. Gigantic pillars of carved limestone, each one representing years of labor, decades of expertise. The doors were massive, requiring multiple men to open, their weight a metaphor for the difficulty of approaching the sacred. Inside, chambers aligned with astronomical precision tracked the rising sun, ensuring that light entered at exact moments during specific rituals. Nothing was accidental. Every measurement obeyed exact specifications. Every function followed rigid rules. This was a machine disguised as a building, and its purpose was the systematic processing of sin. Around the central structure, rings of courtyards created concentric zones of increasing holiness and decreasing access. Porticos, gates, and staircases formed a system that controlled the flow of thousands of people without chaos. On festival days, when Jerusalem's population swelled from 40,000 to over 200,000, this architectural machinery proved its worth. The crowds moved through designated paths, funneled toward specific destinations, filtered by rules that determined who could go where. The temple didn't just house rituals, it was itself a ritual made stone. But beneath the grandeur lay something darker, something the pilgrims rarely discussed. This was a place of constant blood. Animals arrived alive and left as smoke. The altar never went cold, the fires never died. Day and night, throughout every season, flesh burned to satisfy requirements that no one questioned, because to question was to invite damnation. The stench of burning meat and blood mixed with incense, creating an odor that clung to your clothes for days after leaving. This was the smell of atonement, of sins being transferred from human souls onto innocent creatures who died without understanding why. The temple consumed everything: gold, labor, animals, devotion, hope. It demanded perfection while acknowledging that perfection was impossible, creating a cycle of perpetual insufficiency. You came to be cleansed, performed the ritual, left feeling temporarily absolved, and then returned because the stain of being human never truly washed away. The temple thrived on this cycle. It needed your guilt as much as you needed its absolution. And in that need, in that mutual dependency between the sacred and the profane, something ancient and hungry maintained its grip on human consciousness. Before entering the temple proper, visitors first encountered the colonnades, massive covered walkways that ringed the entire complex like a stone embrace. These porticos were architectural marvels in their own right, with columns rising 15 meters high, their bases wide and solid as ancient trees. The structures stretched for hundreds of meters, creating shaded corridors where thousands could gather simultaneously, protected from the brutal Middle Eastern sun. But these were not merely practical spaces. They were the first filter, the initial test of your worthiness to approach the sacred center. The southern colonnade, known as the Royal Portico, was the largest and most impressive. Historical accounts describe it as capable of housing thousands of people at once, functioning as a meeting point, a place for teaching the law, and a passage toward the inner levels of the temple. Imagine standing there on the morning of a major festival, surrounded by pilgrims from Egypt, Babylon, Rome, and beyond. Dozens of languages created a constant murmur that echoed off the stone ceiling. Merchants sold last-minute supplies. Teachers gathered students. Families reunited after months of travel. This was humanity compressed into stone corridors, all moving toward the same destination with different expectations of what they would find. The walkways were paved with large slabs of polished limestone, arranged in symmetrical sections and separated by double rows of columns. These structures created wide corridors designed to support intense traffic flow while maintaining order. From the upper levels of these porticos, observers could see the precise division of the complex below: outer courtyards, access barriers, and the separation between each sacred area. The temple was organized in concentric layers, and the colonnades marked the beginning of the first one. They served as the outer limit of the sacred environment. From this perimeter, the rules began: levels of ritual purity, restrictions that gradually decreased the number of people allowed to proceed forward. The architecture itself enforced theology. You didn't need guards at every checkpoint because the walls did the work. The height of stairs, the width of passages, the positioning of gates, all of it was calculated to control, to filter, to ensure that only those who met specific criteria could advance. The temple was as much about exclusion as inclusion, about reminding people of their place in a hierarchy that stretched from the dust to the divine. And so the pilgrims stood in these colonnades, having traveled for weeks or months, finally within sight of their destination, but not yet arrived. They could see the inner courtyards, smell the incense, hear the prayers, but they remained on the threshold. For many, this was as far as they would ever go. The architecture had already judged them, already determined their maximum proximity to holiness. They would leave having touched the edge of the sacred, never knowing what lay at its heart. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the temple's greatest power was not in what it revealed, but in what it forever kept hidden. Beyond the colonnades lay the court of the Gentiles, the largest open space in the entire temple complex, a vast stone plaza that surrounded much of the sacred center. This was the only area where non-Jews could legally stand, where foreigners could approach close enough to glimpse what they could never fully access. The court stretched endlessly in every direction, capable of accommodating tens of thousands simultaneously. During Passover, when the city swelled with pilgrims, this space became a sea of humanity, voices in 100 languages creating a sound like distant thunder that never quite resolved into coherence. But calling it a court of worship would be misleading. Yes, prayers were offered here. And yes, the devout came to observe from a distance the rituals they could not join. But primarily, this space functioned as a massive marketplace, a commercial zone where the spiritual and the economic merged into something neither transcendent nor corrupt, but disturbingly practical. Vendors sold animals for sacrifice, doves for the poor, lambs for families, bulls for the wealthy. Money changers sat at tables converting foreign currency into temple-approved coins, taking their percentage with the blessing of the priesthood. The air rang with the bleating of sheep, the cooing of caged birds, the shouting of merchants, the clink of coins changing hands. Jesus would later call this place a den of thieves, and he wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't entirely accurate. It was worse than theft. Theft implies taking something that doesn't belong to you. This was a system where access to God had been monetized, where the poor paid more proportionally than the rich, where your ability to perform required rituals depended on your economic status. The vendors weren't breaking the rules. They were the rules made flesh, the logical endpoint of a system that claimed to serve the divine while enriching the priesthood. Every coin that changed hands reinforced the architecture of control. Yet from an architectural perspective, the most significant element of this space wasn't the commerce. It was the barrier that rose a few meters ahead. The Soreg wall, standing only 1.3 to 1.5 meters high, hardly impressive compared to the massive structures surrounding it. But this low wall carried enormous weight. Inscriptions in Greek and Latin, some of which archaeologists have recovered, delivered a clear message. Any non-Jew who passes this point will be responsible for their own death. Not metaphorical death, not spiritual death, actual execution. The Roman authorities, who controlled Jerusalem, permitted the temple administration this exception to their monopoly on capital punishment. The sacred zone beyond this wall was worth killing to protect. So the Gentiles stood there, pressed against an invisible line, close enough to see but forever barred from entering. They had traveled across oceans and continents, survived bandits and storms, spent fortunes on the journey, all to reach this spot where a waist-high wall informed them that proximity was not access, that being near was not the same as belonging. Some probably felt grateful just to be this close. Others surely felt the rage of exclusion, the humiliation of being deemed inherently unworthy. The temple taught many lessons, but perhaps the clearest was this: there are always walls, always barriers, always reasons why you cannot proceed. And the lower the wall, the more absolute its authority. Those who passed the soreg continued up a staircase that led to the next level, the Court of Women. The name is deceptive, implying exclusion when in fact both Jewish men and women were permitted here. But names have power, and calling it the Court of Women subtly reinforced who was expected to stop at this point. Men could proceed further, women, with rare exceptions, could not. The architecture spoke what the law stated. You may be pure enough to enter, but you are not pure enough to go beyond. Your access is provisional, limited, conditional on factors you cannot change. The court itself was square, surrounded by covered galleries supported by columns smaller than those of the outer porticos, but still substantial, still designed to impress. At the four corners stood chambers serving various functions: administrative offices, wood storage for the altar, purification rooms, and other necessities of the priestly service. These were not decorative spaces. The temple was a working machine, and like any machine, it required fuel, maintenance, parts replacement. The wood chamber alone was critical. The altar fire never went out, which meant a constant supply of inspected, approved lumber had to be maintained. Even the fire that consumed the sacrifices was regulated, controlled, made subservient to protocol. This court functioned as a transition zone between the crowded commercial outer areas and the increasingly restricted inner sanctums. Families gathered here before advancing to the next stages, their final moments together before the men proceeded and the women remained. Imagine being a mother who had traveled for weeks with her son, only to watch him continue toward the sacred center while you waited in this designated space. The temple was filled with these small cruelties, these reminders that access to the divine was mediated by gender, lineage, and countless other factors beyond your control. On the inner side of this court, 15 steps rose toward the next gate, the Gate of Nicanor, one of the most important and imposing entrances in the entire complex. 15 steps, each one a metaphor for ascension, for drawing closer to the unreachable. Levites would stand on these steps during certain festivals, singing psalms that echoed through the courtyards. The music must have been hauntingly beautiful, voices layered in harmonies that the stone amplified and returned. But beauty in the temple was never only beauty. It was a tool, a means of emotional manipulation, a way to overwhelm the senses until critical thinking dissolved into pure feeling. The Court of Women embodied the temple's fundamental paradox. It granted access while enforcing limitation, welcomed worshippers while reminding them of their inadequacy, created community while fracturing it along lines of gender and purity. Those who stood here were inside the sacred zone but not at its heart, accepted but not fully, included but with conditions. And perhaps this is what made the temple so psychologically effective. It gave you just enough proximity to divinity to make you desperate for more, but never enough to satisfy that desperation. The hunger it created was the source of its power, and that hunger could never truly be fed. The Gate of Nicanor rose before those who climbed the 15 steps like a wall of polished bronze, catching the sun and throwing it back in fragments of blinding light. 20 meters tall, its panels crafted from bronze, so skillfully worked that ancient historians recorded it as one of the wonders of the temple. Massive hinges, each one a masterwork of metallurgy, allowed the gates to swing open during ceremonies when the flow of worshippers increased. The mechanism required multiple priests to operate, their combined strength barely sufficient to move the enormous weight. This was not a door you opened casually. Every movement was deliberate, ceremonial, heavy with significance. Bronze is an interesting choice for such a critical gate. Gold would have been more expensive, more obviously impressive, but bronze has qualities gold lacks. It's harder, more durable, capable of bearing weight that would deform softer metals. bronze also develops a patina over time, a greenish layer that forms as the metal reacts with air and moisture. Perhaps this was intentional, a reminder that even the most carefully crafted barriers between the human and the divine are subject to decay, to the slow erosion of time. Or perhaps it was simply the most practical choice, and we're reading meaning into metal that had no philosophy, only function. Beyond this gate lay the court of the Israelites, a narrow space elevated above the court of women, its altitude reinforcing the idea of spiritual progression. Only Jewish men who had maintained ritual purity could enter here, a restriction that eliminated the majority of humanity and a significant portion of the Jewish population. If you had touched a corpse, contracted certain diseases, experienced specific bodily emissions, or broken any of dozens of other purity laws, you were barred. The requirements were so extensive that maintaining constant eligibility was nearly impossible for anyone who lived a normal life. The system was designed to fail you, to ensure that access remained rare and therefore precious. The primary function of this court was observational. Men stood here to watch the rituals performed at the altar, which dominated the space immediately ahead. The court was aligned perfectly with the altar of burnt offering, ensuring that those permitted to stand here had an unobstructed view of the sacrificial machinery. They couldn't participate directly. That privilege belonged to the priests alone. But they could witness, and witnessing was itself a form of participation, a way of being implicated in the blood and fire and smoke that rose continually from the altar. You couldn't stand in this space and claim ignorance of what happened here. The stench alone made denial impossible. A low balustrade separated this court from the next level, the court of the priests, a subtle barrier that nevertheless carried absolute authority. You could see over it, could reach across it if you dared, but crossing it meant death. Not metaphorical spiritual death, but physical execution for violating the sacred boundary. The temple was filled with these lines, these invisible tripwires that determined life and death based on which side your feet touched. And as men stood here, close enough to feel the heat from the altar fire, close enough to smell the burning flesh, they understood the fundamental lesson the temple taught over and over. Proximity to the divine is dangerous, access is controlled, and there is always one more barrier you cannot cross. Beyond the balustrade, in the court of the priests, stood the reason for everything else, the altar of burnt offering. 15 meters wide, 15 meters long, 4.5 meters high, this massive construction of carefully cut stone dominated the sacred space like a monument to humanity's guilt. The stones were covered with a layer of plaster mixed with lime, creating a surface that could withstand constant, extreme heat without cracking or crumbling. Day and night, throughout every season, for centuries, fire burned on top of this structure. The flames never died. The smoke never stopped rising. This was the heart of the temple, the engine that powered the entire theological system. A wide ramp with a gentle incline led up the southern side of the altar, allowing priests to carry animals and offerings to the top without climbing stairs. The law specifically prohibited stairs at the altar, a peculiar requirement whose reasoning was lost to most observers, but meticulously enforced nonetheless. Perhaps it was about preventing any accidental exposure of the priestly garments, maintaining dignity even in the act of controlled slaughter. Or perhaps it was simply another arbitrary rule in a system built on arbitrary rules, each one serving to separate the initiated from the ignorant, the qualified from the unworthy. The ramp itself became sacred through use, worn smooth by centuries of priestly feet carrying dead animals toward flames. The fire that burned continuously required an enormous amount of fuel. One entire department of the temple administration existed solely to manage wood, its storage, inspection, and transportation to the altar. Not just any wood would suffice. It had to be free of worms, rot, or any imperfection that might make it ritually unacceptable. Even the fuel for atonement had to be pure. Think about that for a moment. They had regulations about the wood that burned the animals that carried the sins that separated humanity from divinity. Every layer of the system had its own requirements, its own priesthood of experts who maintained control through specialized knowledge that common people could never fully grasp. The daily rhythm of the altar was relentless. 2 mandatory sacrifices marked the boundaries of each day, a lamb in the morning as the sun rose, another lamb at twilight as darkness approached. Between these bookends, the altar processed voluntary offerings, family sacrifices, specific rituals of purification, and the collective ceremonies of major festivals. During Passover, when Jerusalem's population exploded with pilgrims, the number of animals slaughtered reached into the tens of thousands. The priests worked in shifts, their hands constantly stained with blood, their nostrils so accustomed to the smell of burning flesh that they probably couldn't remember what clean air smelled like. This was their normal. This was holiness made routine. On the northern side of the altar was the slaughter area, where animals were prepared before being lifted to the flames. Marble channels carved into the floor carried blood away to underground cisterns, a drainage system designed with the efficiency of an abattoir because that's precisely what it was, a holy slaughterhouse where the innocent died for the guilty, where the pure became defiled so the defiled could claim purity. And in the center of all this blood and fire and smoke stood the priests, men whose job was to manage the boundary between the sacred and the profane, to handle both the divine and the disgusting, to be simultaneously the most holy and the most contaminated people in the nation. The altar made them necessary, and necessity made them powerful. Before any priest could approach the altar or enter the temple sanctuary, before they could handle the sacred objects or perform the required rituals, they had to perform an act so simple that its significance was easy to miss. They had to wash. Between the altar and the temple entrance stood the bronze laver, an enormous circular basin that held water for the continuous purification of the priesthood. This wasn't a decorative fountain or a symbolic gesture. This was a requirement backed by the threat of death. An unwashed priest who touched the sacred objects or entered the holy place would die. Not might die, would die. The law was explicit, and everyone knew stories of those who had tested it and paid the price. The laver itself was a work of craftsmanship cast from bronze that gleamed in the courtyard sun, its surface constantly wet from the water it held. It was fed by some mechanism that kept it filled continuously, possibly connected to underground cisterns through channels that modern archaeologists can only guess at. The water had to be clean, fresh, without any contamination that might transfer impurity rather than remove it. Priests supervised the laver constantly, ensuring that what was meant to purify could not become a source of defilement. Even the instruments of holiness required guardians, watchers to watch the watchers, an infinite regression of control and supervision. Think about what this washing represented. These were men who had been born into priestly families, who had trained their entire lives for this service, who knew every law and regulation by memory. They had already performed ritual baths that morning. They wore specially designed garments made according to divine specifications. By every measure their society possessed, they were already the purest humans alive. And yet even they, especially they, had to wash again before approaching the most sacred spaces. The message was unmistakable. No one is clean enough. No amount of preparation suffices. The gap between human and divine cannot be closed by effort or training or birthright. It requires constant, repeated, never-ending attempts at purification that acknowledge their own inadequacy. The priests washed their hands and feet, the parts of the body that did the work, that touched the world, that walked through the dust of mortality. They did this multiple times per day, every day, year after year. The same motion repeated until it became muscle memory. The water poured over their skin, carrying away whatever invisible contamination they had acquired since the last washing. And then they would proceed into the sanctuary or to the altar, perform their duties, and afterward wash again. The cycle never ended. The temple created a perpetual state of conditional purity, where you were always only one contamination away from being unfit, always only one washing away from being acceptable. Standing before this bronze basin, watching priests perform this ancient ritual, you could see the entire theology of the temple compressed into a single moment. Access to the divine required intermediaries, the priests. Those intermediaries required tools, the laver, the water, the established procedures. The tools required maintenance, supervision, refilling, inspection, and all of it, every layer, reinforced the same truth. You cannot approach directly. You cannot access without assistance. You cannot be trusted to be pure on your own. The bronze laver wasn't just about hygiene. It was about power. about maintaining a system where access was controlled, where the priesthood remained essential, where the divine remained distant enough to require an entire infrastructure of mediation. After the washing, after all the preparations and protocols, a select group of priests could enter the temple building itself, passing through massive doors into the first interior chamber, the holy place. And here, everything changed. Outside, the sun bleached the limestone white, created harsh shadows, revealed every imperfection. Inside, gold covered every surface, walls, ceiling, floor, creating an environment where light behaved differently, where it reflected and refracted until the entire space seemed to glow from within. This was intentional disorientation, a calculated assault on the senses designed to overwhelm rational thought and replace it with pure awe. You weren't meant to think clearly here. You were meant to feel small, overwhelmed, inadequate. The gold wasn't applied as a thin leaf that would wear away with time. Wooden panels were covered with thick plates of gold, fixed with such precision that the seams were nearly invisible. The result was a room that seemed to be carved from a single massive block of pure gold, impossibly expensive and impossibly heavy. The value of the gold alone exceeded the annual revenue of small kingdoms. But value was not the point. Excess was the point. Impossibility was the point. The holy place existed to demonstrate that human limits meant nothing when serving the divine, that no cost was too high, no effort too extreme. And if you found yourself wondering whether such extravagance was necessary, whether the resources might have been better spent feeding the poor or healing the sick, well, that doubt was precisely what the gold was designed to eliminate. 3 objects filled this chamber, each one positioned with astronomical precision, each serving a specific function in the daily operation of the temple. On the south wall stood the menorah, the famous 7-branched lampstand cast from a single piece of solid gold. It stood approximately 1.5 meters tall, its design featuring branches and cups inspired by almond blossoms, its creation requiring skills that took decades to master. The oil used was not ordinary oil, but the purest olive oil, pressed from the first pressing, filtered multiple times, prepared according to specifications so precise that entire treatises were written about proper production methods. This lamp was lit daily, tended by priests who trimmed the wicks and replenished the fuel, ensuring that light never completely died in this windowless chamber. On the north wall sat the table of showbread, a golden table that held 12 loaves of unleavened bread, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. These weren't ordinary loaves. They were baked according to specific formulas, arranged in specific patterns, and replaced once per week on the Sabbath. The old loaves could only be consumed by priests, and only in designated areas, and only after the new loaves had been positioned. Even bread in the temple carried the weight of law, the burden of regulation. Nothing was simple, nothing was casual. Every object, every action, every moment was thick with requirements that had to be satisfied, or the entire system would be invalid, contaminated, worthless. Positioned directly before the veil that blocked entry to the innermost chamber stood the altar of incense. Small compared to the massive altar outside, but perhaps more important in terms of daily ritual. Made of acacia wood covered in gold, it stood as the final station before the ultimate boundary. Twice daily, morning and evening, a priest would place specially prepared incense on this altar and set it alight. The smoke would rise, carrying with it prayers and petitions, disappearing into the darkness above. The recipe for this incense was regulated by law and could not be reproduced for any other purpose. Attempting to make this scent for personal use was punishable by death. Even smell was weaponized here, made exclusive, transformed into another barrier between the common and the sacred. The priests moved through this golden room like actors in an ancient play, each gesture prescribed, each word memorized, their lives dedicated to maintaining a system that had existed before they were born and would continue after they died. At the far end of the holy place, blocking the entrance to the final chamber, hung the veil, and to call it merely a curtain would be to miss its significance entirely. This was a barrier approximately 20 meters high, woven from threads of blue, purple, and crimson, colors chosen for their symbolic weight and their extraordinary expense. Blue represented the heavens, the realm beyond human reach. Purple signified royalty, the dominion of kings and the authority of power. Crimson spoke of blood, of sacrifice, of the red price that sin demanded. These weren't arbitrary aesthetic choices. Every thread carried meaning. Every color whispered theology. The fabric itself was so thick, so heavy, that it required specialized weavers working for months to produce a single panel. The threads were twisted together with such density that the finished product could block light, muffle sound, and create an absolute separation between what lay on either side. Some ancient accounts suggest it was the width of a man's hand in thickness, heavy enough that moving it required multiple people, solid enough that you could lean against it without it yielding. This was not decoration. This was fortification. This was the final wall between humanity and whatever the Holy of Holies contained, or in the case of the Second Temple, whatever it no longer contained. Embroidered into the fabric were images of cherubim, angelic beings whose presence at the boundaries of sacred space dated back to the Garden of Eden, where they had guarded the way to the Tree of Life with flaming swords after the expulsion. Here they were again, woven into the barrier, eternal sentinels reminding anyone who looked that access to the divine was not a right but a privilege, one that had been lost long ago and could only be temporarily, conditionally restored through an elaborate system of blood and fire and priestly mediation. The cherubim didn't smile. They didn't welcome. They guarded. That was their function. That was their eternal duty. Behind this veil lay the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, the chamber that represented the absolute center of the entire theological universe. In the First Temple, this room had contained the Ark of the Covenant, that golden box holding the stone tablets of the law, the staff of Aaron, and a jar of manna from the wilderness. But the Ark had been lost centuries earlier, likely destroyed or captured when the Babylonians razed Solomon's temple. When the Second Temple was built, and later when Herod renovated it into the massive structure we're exploring, the Holy of Holies was reconstructed with perfect dimensions but empty contents. The room existed, the space was maintained, but the thing that had made it sacred was gone. What remained was a perfect cube, 10 meters in width, height, and depth, its walls covered in gold like the holy place, but receiving no light from the menorah, no illumination from any source. This was a room of absolute darkness, absolute silence, absolute separation. Once a year, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the high priest would pass through the veil carrying blood from a sacrifice, entering this empty darkness to perform the most sacred ritual in Judaism. He would sprinkle the blood where the ark once stood, making atonement for the sins of the entire nation. And then he would leave, because no one, not even the high priest, could remain in that space. Even he was only tolerated briefly, conditionally, with strict protocols that if violated would result in his death. The veil hung there year-round, day and night, forever closed, forever guarding an empty room that somehow remained the holiest place on earth. Everything we've explored so far, the massive platform, the concentric courts, the altar fire, the bronze laver, the golden chamber, all of it existed to support a single ritual that occurred once per year. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was the fulcrum upon which the entire system balanced. On this day, and only on this day, one man could pass through the veil into the Holy of Holies. Not a group of priests, not the righteous or the learned, just one man, the high priest. And even he could only enter after days of preparation, ritual purification, and careful adherence to protocols that, if broken, would kill him instantly. This was not hyperbole. This was not metaphor. The stakes were absolute. The preparation began days before. The high priest would separate himself from his family, undergo ritual baths, study the procedures with other priests who would quiz him endlessly to ensure he knew every step. Nothing could be improvised. Nothing could be approximated. The ritual had to be performed exactly as prescribed, in the correct order, with the correct words, or it would fail. And failure meant not just that the ritual was invalid, it meant the high priest might not emerge from behind that veil alive. There are traditions suggesting that a rope was tied around the high priest's ankle so that if he died in the Holy of Holies, his body could be dragged out without requiring anyone else to enter and risk the same fate. Whether this actually happened or was merely a legend designed to emphasize the danger doesn't matter. The fear was real. The risk was real. On Yom Kippur morning, the high priest would exchange his ornate garments, gold-threaded, jewel-studded, magnificent, for simple white linen. This wasn't a costume change for aesthetic purposes. The gold and jewels represented the glory of the priesthood, the authority and power of the office. But you couldn't enter the Holy of Holies wearing symbols of human achievement. You went in as simply as possible, stripped of everything that might suggest you deserved to be there. The linen was pure, plain, humble. You entered that space not as a victor, but as a supplicant. Not as someone with rights, but as someone begging for mercy on behalf of an entire nation that had spent another year falling short of divine requirements. He would take the blood of a sacrificed animal, first for his own sins, then for the sins of the people, and carry it through the veil. Imagine that moment. The veil parts. Darkness swallows him. He is alone in a way that no other human being experiences, isolated not just from other people, but from light itself, from any sense of where walls begin or end. The room is a perfect cube, but in absolute darkness, dimensions lose meaning. He would move forward, counting steps, feeling for the space where the ark once stood, and there he would sprinkle the blood 7 times, the ritual motion performed by memory because sight was useless here. Each sprinkle carried the weight of thousands of sins, millions of transgressions, an entire year of human failure concentrated into these drops of animal blood. And then he would have to leave, quickly but carefully, because rushing might cause a mistake, but lingering was its own form of presumption. When he emerged from behind the veil, still alive, the people waiting outside would erupt in celebration. The ritual had worked. The atonement was accepted. They had been granted another year. But think about what this system required. The absolute concentration of spiritual power into a single person. The complete dependency of an entire nation on one man's ability to perform a ritual perfectly under conditions of extreme psychological pressure. This wasn't just religious ceremony. This was a mechanism of control, a system that made the priesthood indispensable, that ensured the people would always need mediators, that guaranteed direct access to the divine remained forever out of reach for everyone except a tiny elite, and even they could only approach once a year, in darkness, carrying blood. For centuries, the system functioned. Pilgrims came, animals died, blood flowed, priests mediated. The veil hung undisturbed except for that single day each year when one man passed through it briefly. The temple generated enormous wealth for its administrators, provided employment for thousands, anchored the economy of Jerusalem, and served as the visible symbol of Jewish identity under Roman occupation. It was more than a religious institution. It was infrastructure, politics, culture, and theology compressed into architecture. The idea that it might end, that the system might be rendered obsolete, was unthinkable. The temple had existed for centuries. It would exist for centuries more. This was the assumption. This was what everyone believed. And then, on a spring afternoon around 30 AD, something happened that no one could have predicted. The Gospels record that Jesus of Nazareth, a rural teacher who had spent 3 years making increasingly problematic claims about his own identity, was executed by crucifixion on the orders of Pontius Pilate. The method was common enough. The Romans crucified thousands during their occupation, using death as performance art to remind conquered peoples of the price of resistance. But this particular execution was different. According to multiple gospel accounts, at the moment of Jesus' death, around the time of the evening sacrifice when priests would have been in the temple performing their daily duties, the veil tore. Not at the bottom where human hands might reach, not at the sides where stress might naturally accumulate. It tore from top to bottom, from a height no human could access without massive scaffolding, as if invisible hands had gripped the 20-meter fabric and ripped it in half like paper. The priests serving that day would have witnessed something that their training had never prepared them for. The veil was not supposed to move except when the high priest passed through on Yom Kippur. It certainly wasn't supposed to tear. The replacement cost alone would have been staggering. Months of specialized weaving, enormous expense. But the financial concern would have been trivial compared to the theological crisis this event represented. The veil existed to maintain separation, to enforce the boundary between the human and the divine. Its destruction suggested that separation had ended. The barrier was gone. The system that required priestly mediation, that depended on yearly atonement, that kept the divine safely contained behind layers of courts and rituals and blood, that system had been rendered obsolete in an instant. Of course, not everyone interpreted it this way. The temple authorities would have had the veil repaired or replaced as quickly as possible. Life continued. Sacrifices resumed. The daily routine maintained its rhythm. You can't dismantle a 1,000-year-old system overnight just because something inexplicable happened. Institutions are resilient. They survive through momentum, through the power of habit, through the collective investment of thousands of people whose identities and livelihoods depend on the system's continuation. The temple kept functioning for another 40 years after the veil tore. The priests kept performing rituals. The pilgrims kept coming. Everything looked normal from the outside, but something fundamental had shifted. Some invisible axis had tilted, and though most people didn't recognize it at the time, the countdown to the temple's final destruction had begun. The torn veil became, for early Christians, a symbol of everything their new faith claimed to offer: direct access to God without intermediaries, forgiveness without endless sacrifices, a covenant written on hearts instead of stone tablets stored in an ark that no longer existed. They saw in that moment the end of one era and the beginning of another. But for the temple establishment, for the priests whose entire existence was built around maintaining the system, the torn veil was either a problem to be fixed and forgotten, or a sign they chose not to read. The temple was too big to fail, too central to Jewish identity, too embedded in the political and economic structure of the region. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that within a generation, Roman soldiers would finish what the torn veil had begun. In 70 AD, 40 years after the crucifixion, 40 years after the veil tore, the temple faced its final day. The Jewish revolt against Roman occupation had been building for years, fueled by zealots who believed God would intervene, who thought the temple's presence guaranteed divine protection, who convinced themselves that faith could defeat legions. They were wrong. The Romans, led by the future Emperor Titus, besieged Jerusalem with methodical brutality. Starvation devastated the city. Factions fought each other even as enemies surrounded the walls. And when the Romans finally breached the defenses, they showed no mercy to the structure that had dominated the skyline for generations. The sanctuary caught fire. Whether by accident or deliberate order remains disputed by ancient historians. What isn't disputed is what happened next. The gold that covered the walls, the gold that had reflected lamplight for centuries, melted in the heat. Liquefied precious metal ran down between the stones, seeking every crack and crevice, filling the spaces between massive blocks. When the fire cooled and the gold solidified, Roman soldiers began systematically dismantling the walls block by block, prying apart stones that had been set with millimetric precision, searching for the gold that had flowed into every gap. The temple wasn't just destroyed, it was dismantled, unmade, reversed from existence with the same thoroughness with which it had been constructed, but the altar where fire had burned continuously for centuries went cold. The bronze laver that had purified thousands of priestly hands was hauled away as scrap metal. The courts where pilgrims had gathered, where commerce and worship had merged into a complex ecosystem of faith and finance, became rubble-strewn ruins. The colonnades collapsed. The staircases that had separated one level of holiness from another crumbled into meaningless piles of broken limestone. The Soric wall, that low barrier that had enforced the separation between Jew and Gentile with the threat of execution, was reduced to fragments that couldn't exclude anyone from anything anymore. In a matter of days, the Romans accomplished what seemed impossible. They erased the temple. The Holy of Holies, that perfect cube of darkness where the high priest had entered once a year, was destroyed along with everything else. The space where the ark had once rested, where blood had been sprinkled for centuries to atone for national sins, became indistinguishable from any other patch of ruined ground. The veil, whether it had been repaired after tearing or left damaged, burned along with the rest. The cherubim embroidered into its fabric vanished in smoke. The barrier that had existed for so long, that had defined the limits of human access to the divine, ceased to exist in any physical form. If you had stood in the ruins afterward, you wouldn't have been able to identify where the courts had been, which stones had belonged to which walls. The architecture of separation had been obliterated. What remained visible was only a portion of the retaining walls that Herod had built, the massive platform that had supported the temple complex. The Western Wall, known today as the Wailing Wall, became the most accessible remnant, and over centuries, it transformed into a site of mourning and prayer. People come there still, pressing written prayers into the gaps between ancient stones, touching rock that once supported the structure that had defined their ancestors' relationship with God. But the temple itself, the building with its courts and altars and golden chambers, exists now only in historical records, archaeological fragments, and the collective memory of a people who lost their spiritual center and had to completely reimagine what worship meant without it. After 70 AD, Judaism faced an existential crisis. The entire religious system had been built around the temple. Laws governing sacrifice, purity, priestly duties, thousands of regulations suddenly became impossible to obey because the infrastructure they required no longer existed. You can't sacrifice at an altar that's been torn down. You can't maintain ritual purity for temple service when there's no temple to serve. The Day of Atonement, that crucial annual ritual where the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, couldn't be performed. There was no high priest, no Holy of Holies, no veil to pass through. The entire theological operating system had crashed, and there was no way to reboot it. Jewish scholars and rabbis performed something remarkable in response. They completely restructured their faith to function without the temple. Prayer replaced sacrifice. Study of the law replaced priestly service. Synagogues, which had existed alongside the temple, became the primary locations of worship. The religion adapted, evolved, found ways to maintain identity and community without the physical structure that had anchored everything for a millennium. This transformation was sophisticated, thoughtful, and ultimately successful. Judaism survived the loss of its temple and thrived in diaspora, maintaining coherent theological frameworks that didn't require the sacrificial system. But the adaptation came at a cost. An entire dimension of the religion simply ceased to exist. For Christians, the temple's destruction validated what they had been claiming since the crucifixion, that Jesus' death had made the entire system obsolete. The author of Hebrews, writing to Jewish converts to Christianity, argued that Jesus was the ultimate high priest, who had entered not an earthly holy of holies but a heavenly one, carrying not animal blood but his own, accomplishing atonement not temporarily but permanently. The torn veil, in this interpretation, wasn't a disaster to be repaired, but a declaration that the old system had fulfilled its purpose and been retired. The destruction of the temple 40 years later simply made physically obvious what had become spiritually true at the crucifixion. The age of sacrifices was over. But there's something deeply unsettling about a theological system that requires a building to be destroyed in order to prove itself obsolete. Could the new covenant not coexist with the old? Did the temple have to burn for Christianity to be valid? The early Christians would have said yes, not because they wanted destruction, but because the two systems were fundamentally incompatible. You couldn't claim that Jesus' sacrifice was sufficient while maintaining a system that said sacrifices were still necessary. The temple's continued existence created a theological contradiction that could only be resolved by one system ending. And so it ended. Whether you see that ending as tragedy or fulfillment depends entirely on which side of the torn veil you were standing when it ripped. The physical absence of the temple created space for new interpretations. Paul wrote about believers' bodies being temples of the Holy Spirit, relocating the sacred from a building in Jerusalem to the individual human form. The book of Revelation described a new Jerusalem where no temple existed because God's presence filled everything, eliminating the need for specialized sacred spaces. Christianity developed a theology of presence rather than separation, of access rather than mediation, of a God who came near rather than remaining behind veils in dark rooms. This was revolutionary, even radical. It democratized the sacred, claimed that what had once been available to one man once a year was now available to everyone always. But it also made religion less tangible, harder to see and touch, more dependent on faith and less on sensory confirmation. You can't point to God in a church the way pilgrims could point to the temple and say, "There, that's where divinity lives." The story should end with the destruction. The temple burned in 70 AD. Judaism adapted. Christianity spread. The site became contested ground, fought over by different empires and religions. Today, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque occupy the Temple Mount, making any discussion of rebuilding the Jewish temple not just theological, but geopolitical, entangled with conflicts that have killed thousands and show no signs of resolution. A rational analysis would conclude that the age of the temple is over, that its time has passed, that attempting to resurrect it would be both practically impossible and spiritually unnecessary. But rationality has never been the primary driver of religious expectation, and there are millions of people who believe the temple's story is not finished. Various prophetic texts, in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, describe a future temple. Daniel mentions sacrifices being stopped, which implies they must first be restarted, which requires a functioning temple. Jesus, in the Olivine Discourse, speaks of a future abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, referencing something that hasn't happened yet and requiring a temple to happen in. Paul describes a figure he calls the man of lawlessness, sitting in God's temple and claiming to be God. Again, impossible without a temple structure. And the book of Revelation includes scenes involving a temple during the end times events, though interpretation of these passages varies wildly among scholars and traditions. In Jerusalem today, there are organizations dedicated to preparing for a third temple. They have recreated the temple vessels according to biblical specifications: golden implements, priestly garments, instruments for sacrifice. They have identified and trained men from priestly lineages who could theoretically serve if a temple were built. They have architectural plans, budgets, logistics worked out for every aspect of temple construction and operation. What they don't have is permission to build on the Temple Mount, because doing so would require demolishing Islamic holy sites, which would likely trigger a war that could engulf the entire region. So they wait and prepare, and believe that somehow, at the appointed time, the political and religious obstacles will be removed and the temple will rise again. The eschatological implications are significant across multiple faiths. Many Christians, particularly those in evangelical and fundamentalist traditions, believe that the rebuilding of the temple is a necessary precursor to Christ's return, that end times prophecy cannot be fulfilled until there's a temple for the Antichrist to desecrate. This creates the strange situation where Christians are supporting the rebuilding of a Jewish temple, not because they believe in temple theology, but because they think it will trigger the apocalypse. Some religious Jews oppose the idea of a third temple, arguing that it can only be built by the Messiah, that human attempts to reconstruct it are presumptuous and possibly blasphemous. Others work actively toward its construction, seeing it as the restoration of proper worship and the fulfillment of divine promise. What would a third temple mean? If it were somehow built, if the impossible political obstacles were overcome and construction began, would it vindicate those who believe the sacrificial system was never meant to end? Or would it be a regression, an attempt to resurrect a corpse, a denial of whatever spiritual evolution the temple's destruction was supposed to accomplish? The questions have no easy answers. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the temple, in all its iterations, has always been less about answers and more about questions. Questions about how humans approach the divine, about whether proximity requires mediation, about what it means to be holy in an unholy world. The temple in Jerusalem is gone, but the temple as symbol, as idea, as theological problem that every generation has to wrestle with in their own way, that temple has never left. It stands forever at the intersection of faith and doubt, stone and spirit, the human desire to build monuments to God, and the divine tendency to abandon those monuments the moment we finish building them. The temple is gone. Long live the temple, and may we finally learn to see beyond its walls to whatever truth they were always meant to obscure.